All right, I thought I would talk about something. Now, it's all going to be connected at the end, but it's going to come from different sources to begin with that I'll address. And that is what does the drug community have to do with Skinner boxes and Mouse Utopia? And what does the right being mostly rural or maybe suburban sometimes versus the left being urban, and maybe suburban sometimes have to do with each other? And why is the left schizophrenic, whereas the right is integrated? The left has God complexes, whereas the right is holistic. And why does the left want daddy government to take care of their every need, whereas the right wants the community to do so, and so on. And now you might be able to find the hints in this whole thing. Um, and why does the drug community mostly exist in um, uh, highly fetishized of the power of mankind communities, whereas the right is more, it's in God's hands than the left is, and yet the right is more healthy and happy generally. Um, Basically, what's going on with the left supporting green communism versus the right supporting right wing is it's essentially playing out the old tradition of the cities being hellholes and the rural communities being safe havens, and it's an ancient awareness that most people prefer to live in the countryside when they're rich and powerful than prefer to live in the urban cities and so on. It's a playing out of that whole history, throughout history rather, and so on. Now, this also has ties to the fact that flashbanging primitive tribes with modernity tends to make them lie down, and starve to death when there's fish ready to be caught in the rivers nearby, and so on. Basically, what goes on when you're in a city is you get enamored with the power of mankind because almost everything around you environmentally is people. And in the countryside, nature is the source of your well being. Now, this also ties into the fact that the left fetishizes green energy, like windmills and power solar panels, whereas the left prefers its energy generation to be nuclear or gas or oil or coal or something like that. Um, but you notice how there's a trend where if you're a city dweller who doesn't actually grow anything, um, and you're a ruralite who does grow things, you're going to have a wildly different politics, generally speaking. And it's going to be left and right, specifically, generally speaking. And it all ties to whether you have a bureaucratic or a cultivator approach to society through the mechanisms of your upbringing and living conditions and so on. So you could say the material conditions lead to the spiritual conditions of the people on some level, to borrow from Marx slightly, and so on. However, it's not like a simple, like, I'm poor, they're rich, therefore I'm going to steal from them, or kill them and take their stuff kind of thing. It's more like the entire modus operandi or operandi, mode of operation. of the community you live in determining your relationship with society and so on. And this isn't to give ammo to the left, because I'm thoroughly anti leftist, but it's to give ammo to the right by acknowledging that the right has the superior living conditions to the left. But the fact of prosperity leading to greater city growth leads to leftism and so on. Um, um, Better a small community you're a part of deeply than a wider community you're shallow with. Um, so the breakdown between women and men is the woman domain is particularly social. That's her environment. Like, it's totally her environment. The man, however, is more at home in nature, the physical world. And that's why the bureaucrat versus cultivator approach is different between the two in some fashion. Now, there is the ability for women to cultivate and the men to be bureaucrats and so on. But this is like their version, their typical version of things and so on. So the men will grow the plants and tend to the animals and so on naturally, and hunt for food naturally, and do logging and oil derrick work and so on with nature, where the woman will be more at home, say being a VTuber or like a YouTube streamer or like a pillar of the supportive community as opposed to the justice and civic community where the men are, and so on. And one begins to understand the proper outlines of a society through this with their overlap and their differences. So it's a bit of a Venn diagram in some fashion, or slightly like a Venn diagram, but not entirely. Yeah, and there's things that they can both do, like discipline a child, but the man's better at it and for providing and protecting the family, whereas the woman is more the supportive, loving, compassionate member of the family and so on in the family unit. And that's natural to them and so on. And that's their natural area of competency more often than not. There's some degree of overlap, but like that's what it is. Now, the thing is, essentially, what's going on with the invasion of the shires and the taking of farmers' lands to make hotels and apartments to house the immigrants is essentially the playing out of the bureaucrat urbanite against the holistic rural individuals. So, despite the fact that the Greens and communityists or communists are talking about how they're for the environment and the earth and all its people and so on, what's really going on is they're only for a fetish of it, an idol, like something to be smashed. They're for a fake version that's truncated or cut off from the fullness of the real thing. That's why I'm totally right wing, basically. Anglo right wing, and so on. It's a very the left is a very, as it stands, a very inappropriate viewpoint. And it's very daddy government and like investing all their support into one single thing, one single point of failure, where if it goes bad, it will. And the thing about we learn from civilizations and society and life is that you cannot trust anything fully except God, basically. if you even believe in God. And if you don't believe in God, then the smart thing is you don't trust anything whatsoever fully. But just because you don't trust something fully doesn't mean you don't trust it deeply. Right? So the left is very shallow on all things and then all in on something that they really shouldn't be all in on, the daddy government. And this is a stripping of the natural order and condition of humanity when they're well off from civilization. It's a drug addict's version of the do thing get reward mechanisms, basically. And that's a problem of modernity, in essence. It's a problem because it makes life miserable in actuality. You know. And what the thing about the cultivator, right wing, countryside individual with a small but deep community and are trusting God fully, but no one else fully, even if they trust them fairly deeply, even if they have a small network of friends and family and colleagues and neighbors and so on, they get to know them better and so on. There's not that faceless sort of like, I don't know you kind of experience too often. Now, this ties into why people are more right-wing and, let's say, bigoted when they're right-wing and so on, because you're more attuned naturally to close-knit community that you actually know well already, and foreigners are a little suspect and you're not used to it. But you notice how the end result of being used to the fact you don't know anyone is a fetishization of natural living, basically. Church exists to bring people together, basically, through united philosophy, let's say, to use a term that's roughly correlating to, roughly similar to what I'm talking about. So it's a combination of we share similar philosophies of life, and we also don't know each other usually day to day for a wider community, essentially. And I mentioned this early in my Existential Crisis Guide and Toolkit at some point, that essentially you need to find your tribe and terrain, and your terrain is your philosophy and your tribe is your people. And generally speaking, locationally, your tribe will share a lot of your philosophy in the deeper sense, even if the exact individual expressions are different somehow. You know, like you can have someone who's sort of a little feminist in a way, but they're mostly Christian, and it's like, okay, they've got some kinks or quirks, and they're less than perfect, but they share in Jesus Christ. So you know that they can actually be like trusted if you like were like they look out for you, basically, if push came to shove. Yeah. And the left simply doesn't have that. That's why the left talks of allies and the right talks of friends, and why the right is loyal to their personal tribe over their political tribe, and the left is loyal to their political tribe over their personal tribe. This is why the most racist man and his girlfriend joke or meme exists, because the man is loyal to his wife, even if she's technically a different skin color. And it makes perfect sense for the right wing because of these factors, whereas the left just simply can't understand it. Yeah. So it's a matter of wisdom versus foolishness, right versus left. Um, Now, there's a bunch more I have to say. I just have to formulate it properly, and it's going to take a second to figure it out because I kind of forgot exactly what I wanted to say. Now, the cultivator aspect is really important because you think of a tree, right? Everyone loves trees. Trees are great. And the exact relationship to it is very important because the cultivator sense means you're cultivating it to an end use to some extent, but you're allowing a lot of the process to happen outside of your control, more or less. And the thing is that actually works, and people might not. And the thing about the fetishization of the power of mankind and the need to control everything perfectly in our own power is a function of living around other people constantly as the main environment you live in, as opposed to nature as the primary environment you live in. And what this means essentially is that you're not forced to trust in the process and the general system of the world and your local community. So you trust in yourself more, and then you fail, and then you rely on other people more, and so on. And then they fail you, and then you're like stuck because your only environment is other people and yourself, as opposed to nature, which is very faithful to our well-being, more or less, if you know how to respond to it. And that's about trusting the source or God or something like that to have your best interests in mind, more or less, as well as everyone else's. Now, it does take some effort and some approaching it a certain way, and maybe a little bit of education on how to like cultivate, like literally how to farm food and grow fruit trees and so on, or flowers for the bees or something like that. You know, but the left has no ability to do so, which is why they're so infantile or babyish, whereas the right does tend to have these kinds of skills. So it's not about purely being Robinson Crusoe, and it's not about purely being a disabled, mentally ill schizophrenic, let's say, like myself. It's about being like in between the two in a way that's actually healthier, where you're not reliant on everyone else completely, but you're also not completely self-sufficient because you don't have to be, and you can't be, and we all acknowledge this. Essentially, this, but there's a middle ground where it's like you're kind of self-reliant, but you also do stuff with other people, and they help you out, you help them out, you trade with each other, and so on. But relying on the land itself to some extent, with some education and skills and tools and stuff like that that are reasonable, cultivates a sense that is pro-social despite no government forcing you to be social. And Christianity is a work for your own well-being and help others when they need it, so that we're all web integrated and networked and in a web of relations where no one is draining everyone else particularly fully, except the most disabled people, period. It's why St. Paul, the convert, mentioned, "He who does not work shall not eat." He's not saying literally we're not going to feed the hungry who are totally stricken with poverty and like can't walk or anything like that, or are mentally ill. But like even a schizophrenic or like myself or something, or like um, someone who lost an arm, let's say, or something like that, can technically pull some weeds in a garden, or like pull an apple off a tree if it's a low hanging fruit, right? Like they can do that. And like it's about finding your level of ability to contribute to society if you can at all, and trusting that most people can to some degree, some people more, some people less, which is why equality is so bad. And it's the right wing version is much closer to the maxim, each according to their ability, to each according to from each ability to their from each according to their ability, to each according to their need. The right wing is actually closer to that, ironically, because of the fact that it's fuller and more integrated and natural, and these things just naturally coalesce together, and it's like it just works on all levels of when you understand it. Than the left is. The left is like pure sugar, whereas the right is like fruit juice. And both have sugar, but one has nutrients, and it's not like you're dumping sugar into water with, and that's all you're doing. It's like the juices of the fruit are the liquid and the sugars, and they're also nutritious. You still brush your teeth, of course. But the thing is, the right wing version of the fruit juice versus the left wing version of the sugar and then the water is like two separate different things. And the cultivator does the fruit juice, and the bureaucrat does the sugar water. It's artificial. And essentially, because a city does not produce anything, but a small town might, that's surrounded by farms, like a little factory or like a wood mill or something in a town, and so on, with farms all around it. You know what I mean? Like the closest a city can get to making things is manufacturing, whereas a small town with farms all around it can resource grow fruit and food and stuff like that, like crops and animals for meat. And they can manufacture as well, which is why the town is the ideal community, because it's just centralized enough where most people have a close connection to a bunch of other people, and they don't have to travel very far to meet their friends and so on. And so on. But they're also spread apart enough where they can live off the land more easily. And that's why suburbs are better than urban areas, and small towns are better than big cities, and so on. When you're enamored by the flashiness of the big city, essentially that's like a drug hit. It's like a hit. You're taking a hit of drugs. And the thing is, at first it's really great, but it's not the same kind of hit as eating a good meal with friends and family and people you love. And one is simply more sustainable than the other. So, ironically, despite the fact the left talks of sustainability all the time, it doesn't have any sustainability whatsoever. It's a parasite on the actual living conditions of the people that buy into this whole thing. And that's why the left is constantly feeling guilty about paving over the world and the destruction of the environment, where the right wing is not, because the right wing is literally living in tune with nature the right way, and the left is clearly fetishizing its relationship with nature and abusing nature by paving over everything with concrete and little concrete boxes to live in, and so on. And the politics are local in regards to the urbanite and the rural person, down to their bones, basically. Because the urbanite only understands the urban, and the ruralite understands the rural. And the thing is, the urbanite can, I guess, go to the countryside, and the country bumpkin can go to the city. But you'll notice how the one they grew up with is the one they gravitate towards most often. And the city is simply too fetishistic to be appropriate. It's too schizophrenic in the sense of a split mind. It's like it's broken into segments that have no relation to each other, like a drug hit, basically a hit, like taking drugs, versus doing a good work and getting rewarded well for it. It's not integrated. And the tree philosophy of a cultivator is important. So basically, a tree is a thing that has roots by which it takes nutrients into itself, solidifies into a trunk of self, and it's basically solid from the roots. So the tree gets solid from its own intake, and then it blooms into the leaves and the branches and the fruits and the nuts that they produce and so on to provide for others. And the nuts and the fruits are its self-sacrifice. It literally gives its own food and water to its offspring. The shade the tree provides and the fact that the fruit can be nutritious to other things is sort of a byproduct, but it's part of the total system of that God created, whereby things actually work. So the emphasis on directly trying to solve the problem in a really simple-minded way doesn't work with the cultivator mindset. But the cultivator mindset actually works for all the things once you understand it. One is appealing to the simpleton, the simple-minded, and one is rewarding to the sophisticated. And that's one of the things about the rural wisdom and the city's intellect, let's say, Faustian bargaining, Luciferian intellect, versus rural or countryside wisdom and folk wisdom, that is part of this whole thing, essentially. And what one learns is one gets by a lot further with wisdom than they do by pure intellect. And wisdom is knowing your limits and playing within them in some fashion. And intellect is your raw ability to do things. The person who overextends, but the person who can go 50 miles and tries to go 100 is worse off than the person who can go 25 and goes 20. Let's say per day, right? There's a pure effort, it's all on me, it's all me doing the good kind of manic episode, and then it's the depression, the crash, it's a boom and bust as opposed to consistent effort. And I have a working theory that the tortoise and the hare is the hare ran so hard he actually crashed in exhaustion, not out of laziness, but because he couldn't go any further. And that's why he had to nap. Whereas the tortoise went at the pace he could manage and just kept going in that story at the speed he could manage so that he didn't tire out completely before the end and beat the rabbit, because the rabbit just went boom bust, and the lesson of that story is slow and steady wins the race. So the obsession with building to the heights of glory is a problem, whereas doing a manageable pace that you can keep going on is actually relevant to the whole success or failure dynamic. It's a folk wisdom thing, but I mean, literally, you can try sprinting at the beginning of a marathon and see how far you run after that, basically. It's literally like built into our biology, and essentially, it's not just folk wisdom, it's like literally biologically real. It's why humans win at hunting, even when everything is faster than us in short spurts, because we can literally walk the thing. We can walk 10 meters, it runs 20. We walk 20 meters, it runs 20 again. We walk another 20, it runs 20. And then we walk 20 and it runs 20 and then collapses in exhaustion. We walk another 20 to catch up to it, and then we stab it. Humans are pursuit hunters. We're enduring. And the mind is supposed to exist to let us see into the future, not just for the momentary good, but for the follow-through effects of our actions and the consequences of the path we take, so that we see further into the future, so that we can be more enduring in our efforts wisely, with minimal effort required for maximum success. The problem with the fetishization and the left approach is that it maximizes short-term gain for long-term loss. The right-wing approach maximizes short-term loss for minimizes short-term gain in some ways for maximum long-term gain. So it sacrifices the present for the future, because the future is supposed to be a longer time period than the present. And the thing we learn is the third worlders don't have this mental capacity available. Like, literally, sometimes it's because they're genetically like 65, 70 IQ, which is clinically retarded, literally. It's like clinically. It's like the official, like, you are definitely mentally retarded kind of relationship, or because they don't have the cultural education, even if they're biologically mentally capable, to take in this whole, like, the future exists and you should plan for it and account for where you're going to be because of what you're doing now, and so on. What Christianity does is it plays a little differently than what you might initially think when I said the left is all about me and what I can do and what I have to do and how I'm good because I do it. What Christianity does is it takes that approach that you might get from what I was saying about how you think ahead and think of all the consequences and so on, and it puts a cap limit on how far you need to go with that. I mentioned earlier a soft closed system with the infinite affecting it, so that things are new and they're not totally chaotic either. So there's some new and there's some order, as opposed to total chaos and sameness. And basically what it is the limit that Christianity puts on how far you have to think ahead on every little thing is basically, it tells you the right approach to the combination of long-term gain for current investment and the impossibility of planning ahead for every future until you die. And that is, it says, don't be prideful. Because if you don't have the Christian framework, you might get your ego up a little too much if you engage in this successfully, generally speaking. And that's what it means to be wise as opposed to intelligent. Because I'm a very intelligent person, but I've been learning wisdom over the years through hardships and essentially nerfs to my abilities. I'm learning wisdom by being loaded up beyond my capability to live well under my own pure intellect. And what I've learned is essentially the trick Christianity puts on the limits to ego to being smart is it says don't just think your own abilities are good enough. Trust in the source of all existence, even the existence of the universe, to conspire to give you good things if you approach it the right way. And the right way is you put in as much effort as you can consistently. You are humble, which doesn't mean you think poorly of yourself or bad about yourself, but you think about yourself less often, let's say. And it doesn't have to be you never think of yourself. It can be sometimes you think of yourself and sometimes you think of other people. And then you might have like a hope, like a belief that you'll be okay in the end and make it to the best life possible and so on. Deep in your heart, even when everything's going wrong, and like it's the deepest level of your heart, not every level of your heart all the time, let's say. So you can still be sad, you can still like be like fearful, you can still be like, I don't know how I'm getting out of this. But God will provide a way. You know, it's like this, like this isn't necessarily just a Christian thing. You don't have to believe the source of all existence is conspiring on your behalf in the end for your good as well as everyone else's as much as possible. And it has to be a person, but you can believe it's a person. You can believe it has a certain degree of interest in your morals and your character and your principles and so on. And that it has teachings it gives to people and so on. But even if you don't believe it's a personal will, a personal God, you can still copy what I'm saying more or less, just not quite the same way as with the person, which I believe is important to get in the full thing completely. You don't have to do it completely, though. This whole thing that I've been describing will be useful even if you don't go quite the distance of saying God is a person as opposed to the universe and karma, let's say. Right? And this is more of a sort of, if it is some sort of karma description I'm giving here, it's you can see it's not just the do good, do bad, get bad, simple-minded version. It's like an exploration of the mechanics of the entire process in an integrated fashion is what I'm doing right now. And essentially, the reason why people let's see, I got at least one more concept or topic or part of this that I want to get off, and then I'm not sure if I have anything more. But basically, the left obsesses with self-sacrifice, but never does it. The right talks of self-sufficiency and then does do it somewhat, but not perfectly. And the thing is, the left is like the sugar water, and the right is like the fruit juice, where essentially, I mentioned the tree. The tree becomes self-sufficient, sort of, so to speak. Not totally. They exist with the soil and the air and the sunlight and the rain and so on. But you know what I mean. It's not reliant on other trees necessarily. Sometimes they actually can network and contribute to each other as necessary and so on of their species to help them reproduce more. And that's what the right does, essentially. That's the right's approach to things. The left obsesses with the fruit and the shade, but they don't believe in the roots or the trunk. And that's a very easy thing to do. And I'm not saying self-sacrifice isn't one of the highest goods, but there's a whole prerequisite of things that exist for self-sacrifice. And the sugar water element of self-sacrifice is you're getting to the desired end, or you're gunning for it without the prerequisites or previously required conditions where that actually is a helpful thing to do for yourself and other people. And true self-sacrifice is giving yourself up and your goods and suffering for other people's sake, and so on. But when you're sugar water fetishizing it, you're basically being a miserable bastard, giving everything you have and then needing other people to give you what they have. That's a very inefficient way to do it. You should be self-sufficient in relation to other people as much as possible, or somewhat, not entirely as much as possible maybe, but like a lot of self-sufficiency in a way. And self-sufficiency doesn't mean you're not reliant on the system, like the environment, or the trees, or the animals, or the fruit, or the wheat, like the bread-making plant, or like bacon, or like cows for beef. But it means you're not, like, completely unhelpful to those around you, essentially. And a pillar of the community that supports other people is someone that relies on the natural world in some sense for their good, and then provides good to other people. And the thing is, the left fetishizes the billionaires as these people who are not doing good enough, but they're not looking at themselves and their own failure to do that exact thing. Now, the free market essentially exists because it's the most natural way that we actually pull this off when combined with church and community and neighbors and so on in a small, tightly knit community. The urbanites fetishize the daddy government as the source of all good things, like God or something, and it's not God. And they fetishize not knowing the faces of anyone around them and so on day to day. So it's a very broken system in the left and the cities, whereas the countryside and the right wing are integrated again. The left fetishizes these things and talks of them because they lack them. And when the right talks about, like, giving up your life to your brothers in Christ and so on, and sacrificing yourself for humanity, it's because they lack those things to some extent in a way, but it's better that more people are kind of quote-unquote self-sufficient in some sense through the natural world's gifts to us, through the gifts of God's creation to us, than to rely on each other, cut off from the environment or nature and God and what God created on earth, relying only on ourselves and each other. There is no avoiding a humanity that doesn't rely on the natural order on some level. But the fetishization of the green movement and the communists and the city dwellers and the leftists and the feminists does not compute in good living. It's a broken, unintegrated system compared to the right-wing countryside community and church and free market. I'm not saying there is no room for any leftist stuff entirely, in a sense. Like I personally benefited from a basic welfare state. But I am going to say that when we got more socialist in my province of Canada, and the green movement and the mass immigration started, everything got way worse for me on the same programs that I had before. as a citizen of Canada and my province. So the proof is in the pudding for these relationships. Low taxation, basic welfare pay better as on the same program, on one program, sorry, than high taxation, green movement, mass immigration, and socialism on on two subsidies and the same program. So it's like literally like there's a performance gap between the two. And the thing is, the problem with social programs and taxation to support it and going into debt constantly to support it is there's no internal regulating mechanism to that concept to stop it from becoming too much. Because if you're just going to take 90% of someone's money, why are they going to work 90% of the way? And then you get into the whole like, well, we'll just force them to work. And then you get into slavery. And that's like the left's approach to this whole thing. And that's why they say taxation is theft and slavery. Because what it's saying is essentially that the force people to earn $1 billion so you can take 950 million from them is inappropriate. People don't want to lose 90% of their money or their income for the sake of people they don't know or care about. So they stop working. Or they move to somewhere that doesn't do it, and then you lose their abilities as a person who makes things work. And that's the brain drain, and that's why white flight and stuff like that, and like people not wanting immigrants and so on happens because they're not productive. They're welfare recipients, or they're low-wage earners. And the purpose of the neoliberals led to more socialistic, woke mass immigration policy, because it's actually tied together in the end, neoliberalism and wokeism and mass immigration. It started with the neoliberals basically saying, like, if we get the immigrants, we can make them slaves and provide for our welfare state. And it turns out they don't even provide for the welfare state. They're recipients. They take from the welfare state. So what we're learning is all these little things and parameters define the well-being of a civilization long term, or not, or the opposite. And what we're learning is the right-wing stance of free markets and community and church essentially is the only path to the prosperity of a community or a people. Yeah. And then the left tries to guilt trip the right into, oh, we were slavers, we were conquerors, we were empire builders, and so on, and so on. And then they try and guilt with, we're killing planet Earth, so we need to die off. And then they like go and turn around and like, we're getting colonized and empire built by the foreigners. And then the left says that's good because it's good revenge. And it's like, I thought the purpose of this was to grow past the need for revenge. Wasn't that the purpose? You know, to like heal wounds as opposed to constantly fighting back and forth for our very survival. And also we can make peace. And then there's also like the whole dying off to save the planet thing. And it's like, we're being miserable and poor. It's like, no, our countries are basically net zero already, or like better at not polluting the planet per person than any other countries. We're doing the best in that direction of anyone. So why do we have to suffer the green thing because we were doing it before the green thing? Why do we have to suffer for green stuff when we were doing more of the green stuff than anyone else was before the actual green movement kicked in? So we're either dying off or being broke and poor as shit, essentially. And then, like, they're not, like, letting the population dwindle and then letting other countries handle their own population and sustainability. They're, like, they're letting the other countries load their people onto our lands while we die off. And it's like a takeover. And the thing is, even from the green perspective, for the good of humanity, it doesn't make sense because the foreigners don't share any of our green or environmental considerations. So you're defeating the entire purpose of letting our population die off, essentially. Which is to save the planet Earth's environment for the continued well-being of humanity. Because the other civilizations and peoples don't believe in it whatsoever. So at every single level, the left and the city dwellers and the environmentalists, or the green movement specifically, there's such a thing as environmentalism that's not like fetish material. It's just sort of good, like basic environmental regulations. Like don't dump like cyanide into a river or something for a chemical factory. But basically, city-dwelling feminist ecological communists with mass immigration is wrong on every level of analysis, and right-wing community, church, free market, countryside people are correct objectively. And the reason the left is so flashy and sensationalist and simple-minded and like out of context for everything and so on is because they're wedded to this idea that if you can keep people stupid and blind, they'll be in charge. And the upper levels of the movement, unlike the foot soldiers, know exactly what they're doing. They're cannibalizing humanity for their own power, and the foot soldiers are believing in their lies and the promises of demagogues and so on. And it's because it's a fetishized worldview. And the thing is, the left's foot soldiers are too stupid, essentially, or uneducated, or because they're city dwellers, perhaps, I should say, are untrained in the wisdom of the countryside, let's say, in how to live life in actual harmony with the world as a person, as a human. So it's not just simple intellect, it's also like your upbringing and your training and your experience and so on. And essentially what that means is for humanity to continue well off, we need more people in small towns in the countryside than we do in cities. Because cities are not conducive to a wholeness or a holistic or an integrated, well-off community. They're parasitic in some sense. And when the majority of people are parasites, society flounders because no one's contributing. Now, I accept that people need sometimes to be more in the city or like a town, let's say, or more in the countryside, and there's differences between people. But what I'm saying is that there should be an emphasis on going back to the countryside and the small towns more than the cities, and the cities should be built down again, and we should kick the immigrants back to their own countries so that they have to deal with their own caused problems, and we deal with the problems that we cause. Right? So we're responsible for ourselves, and they're responsible for themselves. And if they don't want to grow up, then they can suffer and so on. It's not up to us to be childish and stupid for their sake. It's up to us to be grown-up adults, not leftists, for our sake, and then show them a good example of how to live as an individual country so that they can copy it and get success that way, as opposed to us giving over everything we have and suffering, and it's still not enough for them. Right? Like it's literally the difference between bandits stealing from people and like everyone growing in their food in a garden. It's literally the same logic, essentially. The distribution focus versus the productivity focus. The bureaucrat distribution or the cultivator productivity. And what one finds is when more people are focused on being productive and cultivating in their own lives, then suddenly all of these problems naturally solve themselves, because the emphasis on bureaucrat distribution is unhealthy, it's parasitical, it's cannibalistic, it eats its own source of revenue. But the cultivator productivity focus enables you to give what's 5% instead of 90% of your income. And the person, because there's so many people being productive, that 5% actually is more good than the 90% from one person. For those who cannot contribute and must rely on others. So yeah, that's my holistic total system, and so on and so on, and the parameters for why it's important, and so on. And I'll just end with one more thing, which is by trusting in God to provide the victory with forces that you cannot see yourself, when you do things the right way, the moral approach, the character approach, the principled approach, the humble approach, and you have a secret hope for victory and winning at life and so on, people will actually, as part of the environment, let's say, as people as the environment, will actually notice that character difference, and they will think for themselves, how are they going to follow through if they get their way? And then they'll be like, oh, they're actually good for people and myself if they get their way. And then they'll give them their support, essentially. You know. Now, I know that I know that people will say that means sometimes you'll act like a beautiful loser as opposed to a actual winner at politics. And I know politics is a bit of a conflict playing field. So I'm not saying like you have to be totally like naive in politics, or like old timey or folksy, or like put on an act of like benevolence to your enemies. But with this whole system, if you're minimally if you choose a smaller group as possible while still covering your bases of your enemy that you oppose no matter what and want to see humiliated and destroyed, and then for the majority of people you provide an alternative and say, if you want the right way, this is the right way. If you want the wrong way, I will destroy you, or you will destroy yourself, and I'm going to fight you when you try and force it on me. Then you will find that there's a certain degree of respectability that will occur because of it. But it needs to be spelled out and said to some extent. This will provide the impetus for people to grow up, essentially, because that's the other thing. You need people to grow up into the wisdom, because wisdom is intellect with experience in the right fashion. So it doesn't matter how smart you are, it matters how wise you are for good living. The trick with the intelligent as opposed to wise people is they can easily poke holes into things, and the most intelligent people on average are the most wise in some way. But one notices there's a bit of the bell curve going on where you got Grug, the 90 IQ, saying like, God will take care of me. And then you have like the midwit 110, 120 IQ saying there is no God, I don't see God, you're blind and unfaithful. And then you have the 150 IQ saying God will take care of me. Just as an observation. And the midwits have more people than the 150 IQ, but they're smarter than the majority of people at the 90 to 110 IQ. But because of their pride, they don't pay attention to the 150 IQ. But because the 90 to 110 IQ people are routinely around people smarter than them, they are willing to listen to the 150 IQ and try to understand them a little bit, even if they can't totally understand them. Because they don't have the pride of being smarter than average, let's say. And that's why the midwit is slightly higher IQ than average, yet they're also some of the most idiotic in behavior because they're unwise and foolish. And what this means essentially is that getting the midwits to understand the higher degrees of understanding and wisdom and seeing the wisdom in the simple folk ways and so on, and getting them out of their egos is the primary process. Now, the 150 IQ people can have a little bit of pride, and they often do, but the thing is, they're actually kind of less proud in a sense because they've hit the limits of their understanding at times without a ready answer from someone. And they don't have the camaraderie of people agreeing with them, so they have to refine their takes and try and talk down on the level of, not talk down to necessarily, but talk down on the level of those with lesser IQ. So that there's a humility forced on the bottom and the top of IQ, but in the middle of IQ or the slightly above middle IQ, there's enough people that share your views who are smarter than average, where you start to think you're the smartest people ever, even if you know technically deep down inside you're not. Because you're combining a genuine slightly higher IQ with all the smart people agree with me. Because the 150 IQs are relatively rare. But the thing one should notice is the 90 to 110 IQ people generally function okay day to day. The 150 IQ are the true masters, and the 120 IQ are too clever by half, as the saying goes. And that's why the saying exists. So yeah, that's all I got to say. But that should explain the parameters by which we're operating in, and the like contours and like the shape of what's going on and why and so on, and the strengths and weaknesses, the flashiness and the holistic nature of the left and right, and why it's important to advertise which one you are as a right winger in a consistent manner, as opposed to playing the left's sugar water schizophrenic game, but using the fruit juice integration of the right wing. And that'll be the slow and steady versus the tortoise and the hare versus the sprint and collapse through the right and left.